Today I'm showing another Metatrader indicator, and this indicator is based on an indicator available in TradingView, and this is the Pivot Point Supertrend indicator. Let me add that to the chart here. Now I've added the Pivot Point Supertrend indicator to the chart. I'll just right click and look at the properties here. So pivot point period of 2, ATR factor of 3, and ATR period of 10. So these are self-explanatory. ATR period, it's calculating an ATR which is used to determine the distance of these support and resistance lines from this center line. ATR factor of 3 means it's multiplying the calculated ATR by 3. And pivot point period, these are not typical pivot points. Pivot point typically is calculated based on a daily price range. This is actually a pivot point as in a recent high or low, and in this case, factor of 2, it's looking for the highest high with 2 bars to either side, or the lowest low with 2 bars to either side. And as you can see, once a support line forms, the line only moves upwards. In some cases it moves upwards because the center line has gone up, and in some cases it moves upwards simply because the ATR may have reduced, which brings this line closer to the center line. But this never goes down. Even though the center line moves down, you can see there's no downward movement of the support line here. And the opposite for the resistance line, it only ever moves down. The support and resistance lines remain in place until the line is broken, not by a wick, as we can see here, but by a close of a candle. So this resistance line stayed in place here, but then ended as soon as this candle closed above the resistance line. And as soon as the resistance line finishes, the support line starts. And the same, the support line finishes here because the next candle closed below the support line, and when that happens, the resistance line forms. This indicator is not readily available in Metatrader, so I'm going to show you how you can write the indicator. And the reason I'm using this indicator is because I'm also working on a tutorial for a strategy that uses this particular indicator. So I need to first create the indicator in Metatrader, and then I can use it in that strategy in the coming weeks. This tutorial is going to be for Metatrader 4. I have a tutorial coming soon for Metatrader 5, and when that is released, I'll update the description and put a link on the screen to the Metatrader 5 version. And just to show you what we're doing, this is the same indicator on the Metatrader 4 chart. The scale is a little different, so it does look a little bit different, and there are some minor variations because I have different prices obviously coming through this feed compared to the TradingView feed. But it's basically the same indicator where the resistance line is broken by a candle and the support line forms, and that stays in place as here until the support is broken and then resistance forms. And these lines only ever move upwards in the case of the support line or downwards in case of the resistance line. And the calculation of this is exactly the same as for the TradingView indicator. So today I'm going to show how to write the code in Metatrader to reproduce this indicator from TradingView. Stay watching to the end, and I'll also show where I think there is a fault in the TradingView indicator. It may not be, it may be intentional, but I'll show you what I think is a fault, and then I'll show you how I would correct this in the Metatrader versions. So now to write the code, I've opened the Metatrader 4 editor here, MQL4, and as I normally do, inside indicators I have my own folder called Orchard. I like to keep my indicators separate from every other third-party indicator that I might install, and I also like to put each indicator in a separate folder where I will keep multiple versions together if I need to. So I've already created a folder here called Pivot Point Supertrend. So I'm just going to right click that and select New File, and that will open the wizard. It's a custom indicator. Which I'm calling Pivot Point Supertrend. I'm not going to fill in any parameters here. I'm going to do all of that in the code. And I'm also not setting anything here in the plots. I'm also doing that in the code. So now the wizard has created the outline of the indicator for me, but I'm just going to tidy this up a little bit because, as I've said before, I don't like the way these comments are written and I don't like the spacing and layout. Now with that tidied up, first thing I need to do is show how many lines I'm going to be drawing on screen, actually how many components there are to the indicator. And I do that with this hash property indicator buffers. Now this is showing 6. There are actually only 3 lines I'm going to be showing on screen. I'm going to be showing the support line, the resistance line, and the midline. But I'm going to create 3 additional buffers that won't show on screen as working values, because I'm calculating values even when those support and resistance lines don't show. I'm still calculating the values for those so I can carry them forward to the next bar. Now I need to define some properties of each of these indicators. Let's start with the first. Indicator properties are set with this hash property, indicator underscore property name, and then a number indicating which of the buffers I'm talking about. So in this case, number 1 is the first of these 6 buffers. I'm setting the indicator color, firebrick, the indicator width, 2, indicator type is a line, and the indicator style is a solid line, and then a label for that, which I'm just calling resistance. So the resistance line, that label will appear in the data window on the screen, and the rest of these properties are setting the appearance of the line on the chart. And all of these, indicator underscore color, width, type, style, they all end in a 1, showing that they're all talking about the first indicator of these, or the first of these 6 buffers. And now I do the same for the support line and the midline, obviously changing the labels on those, and I'm making them different colors. The support line is green and the midline is yellow, and the midline is also, I've here styled dot, so I'm making a dotted line in the middle. And the dotted line is width 1. You can't actually set styles other than a solid for a width greater than 1. And then the 3 remaining buffers that I'm not going to be displaying on screen, I'm using them just for working values. I'm just setting property, indicator type 4, 5, and 6, draw none, so they won't appear on screen. And next I need the inputs. So from the trading view indicator, there's a period, which is 2, and that shows the pivot point period. So I'm looking for highs and lows with, in this case, 2 bars to either side that are higher or lower. An ATR factor, the default is 3, and that's a multiple of the ATR where the support and resistance lines will be separated from the center line. And the ATR period, which is 10 periods by default. For each of these indicator lines then, and for these 3 working lines, I need double arrays to hold the values with those. So here I'm declaring double buffer resistance, and that's a dynamic array, and the same for buffer support, mid, and then these 3 I'm calling upper, lower, and last. So the buffer upper will be used to hold working values for the resistance, the buffer lower will hold working values for the support, and buffer last will hold working values of the last of the pivot points found, the last of the high highs or low lows found. Now if I move to on init, the first thing I want to do is set indicator digits 5. This will show in the data window. By default that would have been 4 digits, but because I'm working with charts that have prices to 5 digits, I'm going to set that to 5 digits showing in that window. And now I need to map these buffers, these double arrays of buffers, to the indicators. I do that with the set index buffer statement, and note that these are 0, 1, and 2, where above here I labeled the indicators 1, 2, and 3. When using these property statements, the indicators are 1 based, so they begin at number 1. But when using set index buffer, they are 0 based. So this 0 matches what I declared above as number 1. So now, over that little bit of confusion, what I'm saying is that buffer number 0 will match up with the buffer resistance array, and it's an indicator data. By mapping this to an array, that will draw the values of this array on screen as part of the chart, and it will also set this buffer such that it resizes as the number of bars on screen change. So as a new bar forms, a new element will be added to this buffer. And if we've reached a point where the number of bars on the chart has reached the maximum bars, and one of the bars has to drop off as a new bar is created, then the same will happen in this buffer. The element matching that bar will be deleted and the new element will be added. Then I need to do something similar for these 3 working arrays, because I also want those to be resized and moved with new bars on the screen. But these are slightly different. So set index buffer 3, 4, and 5, buffer upper, lower, and last. These I'm saying are indicator calculations, but also so that they don't appear in the data window on screen, I'm doing a set index label 3, null, 4, null, and 5, null, and they won't display in the data window now. And then simply return init succeeded. Now if I go down to on calculate, I have two working values, PP last, so this is the value of the last pivot point found, the last highest high or lowest low that was found. And PP mid is a working value of the midpoint of that channel. Now because I'm looking for a highest high or lowest low with a given number of bars to each side, I need to make sure I have at least that many bars before I can calculate anything. So I'm calculating this value pivot width, and that is equal to 2 times the input period plus 1. So there's the default of input period is 2. I need to find a high or low with 2 bars to each side. So that's 4 bars in total plus the 1 for the bar that I'm looking for. So I need at least 5 bars using the default of 2 here before I can calculate anything. So I've calculated the pivot width, which is 2 times input period plus 1. And then I'm simply saying if rates total is less than pivot width, return 0. So if I don't have enough bars to at least find a pivot, then I'm just going to return 0 because there's no point in going any further. And this is probably a good point to mention. When you come into on calculate, rates total contains the total number of bars available to you. Prev calculated contains the value that was returned from this function last time it was called. And here we have rates total being returned by default. By using these two, I know how many bars are on the chart and how many bars I've already calculated, and I can use that difference so that I don't recalculate everything each time I loop through here. I'm only recalculating the number of bars that have been added or changed. And now to do that, only calculate the changed bars. I need a little bit more calculation to determine how many bars I need to calculate for. So I'm declaring an integer value count, and that is equal to rates total minus prev calculated. The first time this function is called, prev calculated is 0, and rates total is the total number of bars I have available, so count will be total number of bars on the chart. After I've been through this, rates total will return, and the next time these will typically be the same until a new bar is formed. And so in that case, count is going to be equal to 0 in most cases. But when count is 0, the current bar is still changing, so I still want to recalculate that. And when a new bar forms, I want to make sure I recalculate bar 1 as well as bar number 0. So I have this statement, if prev calculated is greater than 0, which means that I have been through this function at least once, then count plus plus just to force at least 1 bar to be calculated. So if rates total is 1 greater than prev calculated, then it just means 1 new bar has formed, and that way count is going to be 2. And if these two are the same, then I just want to recalculate bar number 0 for any changes in price, and so count will be 1. So at the end of this, count tells me how many bars have not been calculated or need to be recalculated. But I can't go all the way to the left in the bars because I do need to allow for this pivot width. So I've got another line here. If count is greater than rates total minus pivot width, then count is equal to rates total minus pivot width. So I'm making sure that I leave that number of bars to the left to look for the most recent high or low. And once I have that, I know how many bars I'm going to calculate. So I have a simple for loop for int I equals count minus 1. I'm beginning with count minus 1 because although count tells me how many bars I have to calculate, the index to those is 0 based. So count minus 1, while I is greater than or equal to 0, I'm counting all the way down to the 0 bar, I minus minus. Now here I'm initializing this working value that I had, the PP last. That is equal to buffer last I plus 1. So buffer last is always going to store the most recent high or low pivot that's been found, and I'm just grabbing that from the index I plus 1 from the previous bar, and I'll use that in the calculations to come. And next I want to test if a new pivot has been found. So has there been a new high or a new low? And remember that I need to leave bars to the right and the left. So I'm not looking at the bar that's just closed, I'm looking at a bar a little further back. First I'm initializing this variable update mid to false, that tells me that at the moment I don't need to recalculate that midpoint of the channel. But if I do get a new high or low bar, then I do need to calculate that midpoint. So I'm just setting it to false here, and I'll reset that if I find a new high or low. Now this code is looking for a new lowest low pivot. First, low pivot bar equals I lowest, symbol bracket bracket is the chart symbol, and period bracket bracket is the chart period. Mode low tells me I'm looking at low prices, and pivot width tells me how many bars I'm looking at, and I simply says where I'm starting. So this will give me the number of the bar that has the lowest low price within a range of pivot width bars beginning with bar number I. And then I'm having a test here if low pivot bar is equal to I plus INP period. Now I plus INP period will be the bar number that is exactly in the middle of this pivot width range. So if the low pivot bar is the bar that is exactly in the middle, then I know that I've actually found a new low pivot bar. So if that is true, then PP last equals low pivot bar. Now, low pivot bar just gives me the bar number. I actually want to get the low price. Low is an array that is passed into this function. Here it is. Low, and the same as high and close. They are passed in and they hold an array of all the high, low and close prices for each bar. So I can simply use low pivot bar to get that low price. I set that into PP last, which I grabbed here initially from buffer last. So now I've found a new low and I'm updating that. And I also then set update mid equals true. And now I have very similar code for the high pivot bar. High pivot bar is equal to I highest, chart symbol, chart period, mode high, I'm looking at the high prices, pivot width, comma I. The same logic, if the high pivot bar is the mid bar, then I reset PP last to be now the high price for that high pivot bar, and update mid equals true. You'll note that if I have found a low pivot bar and it just happens to also be a high pivot bar, so you can get this if you get a particularly tall bar and it creates a new pivot both on the high and low at the same time, then PP last will be overridden by the high rather than the low. This is just a choice. I need to set one, and I'm simply saying I'm going to set that to the high value if I get a new high pivot bar rather than the low value. So now that I've determined if I have a new high or low pivot bar, I need to recalculate the midpoint if necessary. So first, PP mid, this, let me scroll up, this working value that I had here, PP mid is equal to buffer mid I plus 1. So I'm picking up the most recent midpoint. If I need to update the midpoint, so I'm not going to change this if I haven't found a new high or low. If I need to update it, then if PP mid is equal to empty value. Now at the very left of the chart, PP mid is going to have an empty value. So buffer mid won't have any values in it. And that means I'm starting with an empty value. And if I do have an empty value, then I simply set the new midpoint to the last that was found, the PP last that was set here or here. If PP mid is not an empty value, then I already have a midpoint, then I'm calculating a weighted average value for the new midpoint. And that is equal to 2 times the existing midpoint plus the PP last that's been found, all of that divided by 3. So that gives me a weighted average of a new midpoint. And now with all of those tests done, I can store the last and the mid in the arrays. So buffer last I equals PP last and buffer mid I equals PP mid, and those values are in the array now ready for use in the next iteration through this loop. But also if PP mid is equal to 0, I can't calculate a channel. That simply means I haven't found anything yet. This should only be true on the very left of the chart before I find my first high or low point. So if PP mid is equal to 0, I'll just continue and that will restart the loop or go back to the next iteration of the loop. And next I want the values of the ATR so I can calculate the distance of those support and resistance lines from the mid. So that's a simple double ATR equals using the internal function IATR, chart symbol, chart period, and the input ATR period, getting the value for bar number I. So that gives me 1 ATR. Then my deviation, double deviation, equals ATR multiplied by the ATR factor, INP ATR factor. And then the upper value is going to be the midpoint, PP mid, plus that deviation, and the lower value is going to be the midpoint minus that deviation. So now that gives me a value of upper and lower that are equidistant from this midpoint, but remember that those channels only get closer. So if I've had an expansion in the ATR, it will not push the support or the resistance away. And so I need to perform a test before I actually assign those values into the buffers. So looking at buffer lower, and remember this is the working value buffer, the buffer lower. Buffer lower I is equal to, if the close value of I is greater than buffer lower I plus 1. So if it has closed above the previous lower, then I set a value of mathmax of the lower that was calculated here, or buffer lower I plus 1. So if the new calculated lower is higher than the previous lower, which is stored in buffer lower I plus 1, then mathmax is going to return lower, and if not, it's going to return the previous value. If the close is not greater than the buffer lower, then I've actually pierced or broken that buffer lower line, and so I'm going to reset that, and then the value simply comes back as the new lower calculated value. Buffer upper, simply the same in reverse. In this case, if close I is greater than the previous upper, then I take the math min of the new calculated upper and the previous upper. And if close I is not less than that upper, then I've broken that line and I simply set the value to upper. Now that has calculated the working values in the buffer lower and the upper. I need to translate those into the support and the resistance lines. Buffer lower and buffer upper have continuous values. There's a value in every element of this. To display these lines as they should be on the screen, I actually need to set the values to 0 in the support or resistance line where the opposite line is meant to be showing. So I can't simply display this buffer lower and buffer upper. I'm just using those as working values. I'm going to now set the values in the upper or the resistance line and the lower or the support line based on which of those two lines is active. So if buffer support I plus 1 is not equal to empty value, then I have an existing support line. If I have an existing support line and close I is less than buffer support I plus 1, so I've broken that support line. If the support line's been broken, then I want to turn off the support line, so buffer support I now equals empty value, which means that that won't display, and buffer resistance I equals buffer upper I. So I've turned off the support and turned on the resistance by putting a value into the resistance line. This else statement matches this if close is less than. So if close is less than buffer support, I've broken the support. If not, then I simply want to update that support line with the new buffer lower I value. The test for the resistance line is just slightly different. With this statement, I'm simply saying if I have a support line because it's not equal to an empty value. If that statement's false, then I must have a resistance line unless this is the very left-hand side of the chart and I haven't created any lines yet. So the statement here is simply if buffer resistance I plus 1 is equal to an empty value. Because I know I don't have a support line, I'm saying if I don't have a resistance line or the close I is greater than the buffer resistance I plus 1. So I either don't have a resistance line or I've broken it. And in that case, I do the opposite to the support line. If I've broken the resistance line, then I set buffer resistance to an empty value and buffer support is buffer lower. Else, if I haven't broken that line, then buffer resistance is simply equal to buffer upper I. And then I just need to end the for loop. And that's it. Let me compile that just to make sure. Now if I switch to Metatrader, here is my Pivot Point Supertrend, Orchard Pivot Point Supertrend. I drag that onto the chart. I can see default values, pivot point period 2, ATR factor 3 and period 10. Okay, let me bring the scale down a little, and there you can see the lines forming. The resistance line ends here when it's pierced, and the support line begins, and that support line tracks up. If I scroll a little to the left, the same has been the case here. I had a support line that was broken by this bar, and when that happened, the resistance line formed. And if I just shrink that a little, you can see that I have the resistance, support and mid. The resistance only shows where there is a resistance line, and the support only shows where there is a support line, and those three working values don't appear there at all. And now I'll show what I think is the problem with this indicator in TradingView. Just to make it easier to see, I'm firstly going to add the ATR indicator. And then I'm going to modify the settings on this Supertrend indicator to have a distance of 1 ATR from the center line. So that I've reduced the ATR factor to 1. Now if I just move over one of these points where the center has moved upwards, so here for example, the center has just moved up, I can see that the support line is at 05227 and a center line is at 05380. And that's a difference of 00163, which is probably a rounding difference, but very close to what we can see as the ATR there is 00162. If I move to another point where the same thing has happened, just here for example, the support line is at 05080 and the center line is at 05296, which again is very close to the size of 1 ATR, which is 210. But if I move to this point where the resistance line has ended and the support line has been created, the support line is at 4874 and the center line is at 4909, which is a difference of only 00035, where the ATR is currently at 188. Now the reason I think this is a fault, the standard Supertrend indicator will begin the support and the resistance lines at the ATR multiple away from the center, where this indicator is not. When the support flips to resistance or resistance flips to support, these lines are often much closer to the center, and that's because it has been tracking the ATR even when these lines don't appear, and it doesn't do anything to reset that distance away from the center line when the support and resistance flip. That may be intentional, I don't know. You already have the code to write this indicator in Metatrader exactly as it is written here. I'm now going to show how I would correct that problem on the Metatrader side such that this point in the support line will be 1 ATR or multiple of ATR away from the center line. So now back to the MQL4 chart, I'll just change the settings on these to also be 1 ATR so that you can see that the problem is still here. And you can see here, the support line is formed very close to that midline. It should be much further away. Now back in the code, that problem is very easy to solve. And the problem occurs because when the lines flip, I'm simply assigning buffer support to empty value, which is fine, I'm turning that off, and buffer resistance to be the buffer upper. But the buffer upper has been tracking even when the resistance line is not showing. So this has been getting gradually closer to the center line. What I want to do is reset that to be ATR distance away from that center line. And I can do that as simply as inserting a line here to say buffer upper I equals upper, effectively overriding this statement, but only in the case where the lines have flipped. And I can do the same for the resistance line here with a line that says buffer lower is equal to lower value. Let me recompile that. And now back in Metatrader, you can see a much bigger gap here, and that gap matches a multiple of ATR from the center line. So that's it for the Pivot Point Supertrend indicator in Metatrader. As I said, I am creating this indicator because I'm going to be using it very soon in an expert advisor that implements a strategy that uses this particular indicator. So stay watching for that. If you found this useful, then please click the like button And if you want to see more of our videos, including that coming video of the expert advisor for this strategy, then click subscribe and click the bell icon to be notified when we release new videos. Until the next time, thank you for watching.